Good morning. I invite you to open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 10. The history of Noah's family is continuing here. And we call this starting over in a new world with God's blessing. Wait, but this is the wrong one. Oh, sorry. This is the wrong. How did I do that? Didn't sound right. Come on. Well, this is interesting. Pardon me, folks. I don't know what happened to my lesson. Spent a lot of time putting this together, and now it's not showing up here in my recent documents. Okay, let me do a little file exploration here. See what's going on. Wow. Okay, well, I'm. It looks like that carefully crafted and saved lesson has disappeared. The last date modified is December the 3rd. Well, this was last modified last night, which is not December the 3rd. So we're going to have to do without a slideshow today, I guess. I don't know. I don't waste any more time looking for it here. But I don't know why it would have disappeared. Yeah, we could redo last week's, but most of you were here last week, weren't you? No point. You've got the handout, and so we can do this without the slideshow, I guess. Let's just check something else here. See, everything. Wait, okay, here's something that was saved on December 9th, 23rd. Let's see what this one is. Okay. Got saved with the wrong name for some reason. Okay. So there is something here. Okay. We'll go with this then. Genesis chapter 10. Verses 1 through 5. And somehow something is not right. This does not look like the way I usually save it. I usually put the text I'm going to read in red font. That tells me, read this, David. But I didn't do that. But let's read. Okay, Genesis chapter 10. A lot of statistics here, but the statistics tell a story. And I hope that you will see that as we go through this here. If you please don't yawn or check your cell phones. This really is interesting. If you give it a chance. Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Those are not in birth order, by the way. Well, first clue is that we know the Ham is the youngest because it tells us later on in the text that Ham was the youngest. Why is Shem mentioned first? Because he's the father of the Shemites, or what we call the Semites, the Hebrew people. And so to the original audience for the book, the Israelites, naturally he would be the most prominent person. So that's why he's named first here. Does not mean that he's the oldest. we actually can figure out that Japheth was the oldest. The birth order was Japheth, Shem, Ham. And unto them were born sons after the flood. The sons of Japheth, verse 2, Gomer, Magog, Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshech, and Tiras. So we're going to look at these people here in just on a map here. And there's verse 3. The sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. Gomer generally is believed by scholars to be the people that live north of the Black Sea. And on this map, you're going to see it a bunch of times here. The pink, the green, and the orange represent where these people mentioned in Genesis chapter 10 settled. You're maybe asking yourself, well, what about where'd all the people in Europe come from? All the people in Asia, the India, China, Japan, Korea. Where did all the rest of the African people come from? What about North and South America? Well, they were irrelevant to the people to whom the scriptures were originally given, the Israelites. And so God, in the scripture, as he inspired Moses to write this down, only recorded those nations that were surrounding Israel, right there on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, the land of Canaan. These people are given us in Genesis chapter 10 only in virtue of their relevance to Israel itself. Certainly, all the rest of the people, the Europeans and the Asian people and the African people and the North American, South American people, all of them as well were descended from these sons of Noah. But which sons, we are not told. So we're just going to go with what we're given here. So Gomer, the tribes north of the Black Sea. Ashkenaz, that was one of those sons there in verse 3. That's the modern Hebrew name for Germany. And in Israel today, the Ashkenazic Jews are the ones who came from Germany and Eastern Europe, like Poland and Czechoslovakia. They're called the Ashkenazic Jews. There are two main groups of Jews in modern Israel today, the Ashkenazic and then the Sephardim. The Sephardic Jews are the ones who came from Spain, Portugal, and North Africa. Totally different culture than these Eastern European Jews. And the two have clashed in the history of Israel since 1946, but they learned to get along, but they have totally different cultures. It's just something interesting to know about them. There's Ashkenaz in the circle. Riphath, don't know where some of these are. Togarmah, there's where some think that was in eastern Turkey. Magog, apparently this was north of the Caspian Sea. Some equate Magog with Russia. We read about Magog in the book of Ezekiel. In some great future war, there's where who people made this map believe that Magog must have been north of the Caspian Sea. Madai, that's usually equated with the Medes, the Median Empire, which was what is today Iran. Javan, that's the Greek Isles. Elisha, that's usually in the Old Testament a name for the Grecian people. And on this map, they're including them in the island of Sicily and the southern Italy. Tarshish, no one knows for sure where that it was. When Jonah fled to Tarshish, some think it might have been Spain or somewhere else. Some have equated with Tarsus. The Apostle Paul was known as Saul of Tarsus. That was a city in what is today Turkey. We don't know for sure, but we do know the name appears on an Assyrian monument in Nineveh. So the Assyrians did trade with Tarshish, wherever that was, wherever Jonah was fleeing. So there's this map has it on the southern part of Spain. Kittim, that's the Hebrew word for Cyprus, the island there in the Mediterranean Sea, not far off the coast of Lebanon. Dodanim is sometimes spelled with the R, Rodanim, which makes some people think it's identified with Rhodes, a big island in the Aegean. And then Tubal, what is that? Well, Tobolsk sounds like. Some think that's that Tobolsk, a city in the Soviet Union. We don't know for sure. Meshech, maybe tribes of the Caucasus Mountains. I don't want to speed through these because this doesn't have a lot of relevance. Tiras, sometimes identified with the Thracians, which is modern-day Bulgaria. And then we go on to descendants of Ham the youngest, verses 6 through 20. The sons of Ham, Cush, Mitzrayim, Phut, or Put, and sometimes spelled without the H, just Put, and Canaan. Those are the main sons of Ham. 4 sons. Cush, that's the Hebrew for Sudan and Ethiopia, the dark-skinned peoples that were living south of Egypt. And probably from them, other peoples spread farther south and populated Africa. So sometimes Cush is translated in our King James as Ethiopia, and sometimes it's just left as Cush. But when you see it in your King James Bible, just think that's Ethiopia. Those are dark-skinned people. When when God spoke to Jeremiah and said, "Can the Ethiopian change his skin?" Oh, there was something unusual to an Israelite about an Ethiopian skin. Obviously, it's because they were darker-skinned people. So the Cushites, the Cush people, were dark-skinned people. And so they're on Ethiopia, south of the historic kingdom of Egypt, were the Cushites. And they show up now and then in the Old Testament history. Individuals were serving in the army of Israel and so on. So they didn't just stay down there in Ethiopia. Mitzrayim, that's Egypt. That's everywhere in the Old Testament where you see the word Egypt in your English Bible, it's this Hebrew word Mitzrayim. So they settled in the northern Nile Valley. Then Phut, or Put, as it's often spelled, that's the Hebrew word for Libya, people living to the west of Egypt. And then Canaan. And there's the Canaan all along the east shore of the Mediterranean. And it goes into detail then on the people of Canaan later on. So there's the descendants of Cush. Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Ramah, Sabtaka, then the sons of Ramah, Sheba, and Dedan. And notice that these people are living in what we call the Arabian Peninsula today. The people I just read, those are names along the Persian Gulf countries there. And those people today are not particularly dark-skinned. So that not everybody who was a descendant of Cush had dark skin. Some of the pictures of these people and their sculptures, they show a lot of them had very curly hair, like the typical you think of African people today. But it seems like since ancient times they kind of blended in with the other Arab peoples who were represented by the green area on the map. So speed through that. But of interest is Nimrod, verse 8. It says, "And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord." People jokingly call deer hunters today Nimrods. Anyway, he was a mighty hunter. And verse 10 says, "The beginning of his kingdom was Babel," or Bavel in Hebrew, "and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar." That's the fertile valley, the Fertile Crescent area where the rivers of Euphrates and Tigris meet. So here's a son of Cush, and the descendants of these people do not seem to have real black skin, but they were descendants and related closer to the people who settled farther south in Africa, the Cushites. And so Babel, that is the Hebrew word for Babylon, by the way. Every place in your Old Testament where you see the word Babylon, and literally in the Hebrew it's Babel, B-A-B-E-L in English letters. So the Babylonians were descended from this man Nimrod. And his kingdom was Babel and Erech and so on. And out of that land went forth Ashur. Let's see, here's catch up here. No, I'm sorry, wrong place. Ashur is Assyria. I thought I circled that on the map. But just to the north of the circle there is Ashur, the Assyrians. The word Assyria, that with a Y in it, that's from the Greek spelling of Ashur. In the Hebrew, it's always Ashur. So he builded Nineveh. That was a very ancient city where many, many thousand more years later Jonah went. And the city Rehoboth and Kala and so on. And then verse 13, we're skipping down here, Mitzrayim, that's Egypt. And these names mean nothing to us today, but they meant a lot to people back in Moses' day who wrote the book of Genesis. So there's Mitzrayim, and all these people are named. One particular interest to us is the sixth one there, Caslusim, also known as the Pelishtim or Pelishtim in Hebrew, which we call the Philistines in our English Bibles. Because verse 14 says, Casluhim, out of whom came Philistine, or in Hebrew, Pelishtim, and Caphtorim. There's the Philistines. They settled on the plain of the Mediterranean there, they were the first people on the east coast of the Mediterranean that the Romans encountered, and they called themselves the Pelishtim. Well, Romans didn't have a sh sound in their vocabulary, so they called them the Palestine or Palestina, which is where we get the word Palestine. The Palestine is the Roman corruption of the word for Philistines. And then there's Caphtor. That's the ancient Hebrew word named for the island of Crete, which is circled there in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Then we go on to the descendants of Canaan, Ham's youngest son, verse 15. And Canaan begat Sidon his firstborn, and Heth, who is the ancestor of the Hittites. That's just the way the Hebrew language works, okay? If you're a descendant of Heth, then you're a Hittite. So the Hittites were descendants of Canaan, as well as the Sidonians, the major city, which was still a prominent city in the days of the kings, later on in the book of Kings in our Bible. And the Jebusites, who were the original inhabitants and builders of Jerusalem. The Amorites, we read a lot about Amorites in our Old Testament, and especially in the days of the conquest, Joshua, and we don't know much about the rest of these. The Girgashites, the Hivites, the Arkites, the Sinites, the Arvadites, the Zemarites, the Hamathites, who must have actually lived in Hamath, and the Canaanites that included Sodom and Gomorrah, which of course were totally eradicated by the time Israel came into the land of Canaan 400 some years later. And then we get to the descendants of Shem. Now, he is the central figure because he is the ancestor of Abraham and all the Israelites, their great ancestor. This son of Noah named Shem. And we get the word Semite from Shem because in Latin there's no SH sound. So in Latin, Shem becomes Sem. And so we get our vocabulary word Semites, meaning literally a descendant of Shem. Now today, the word Semites only apply to Israelites, to Jews. But that is something that has happened in my lifetime. Within my lifetime, the word Semite has come to be applied only to Jews. But originally, in the universities and college, Semite meant Arabs and anybody who spoke a Semitic language, like Arabic and Hebrew, are all Semitic languages. So the descendants of Shem included the Elamites, the ancient Persians. These are the south part of Persia, down there, as you see circled, the Persian Gulf. Ashur, we call the Assyrians in our English translation. Arphaxad, which is Abraham's ancestor, living there off the Persian Gulf, the city of Ur, where Abraham came from. Lud, the Lydians, they are way over there. Should be a circle around that, but in the southwestern part of Turkey. You've heard of Croesus, richest Croesus. They were the ones who invented coined money. That's Lud. And then Aram, which is the Hebrew word for Syria. And you've heard of Arameans, or the Aramean civilization, Aram. That's Syria there, to the northeast of the land of Canaan. But where did all the Europeans, Chinese, Japanese, and American Indians and so on come from? Well, I've got, all people are descended from Noah's 3 sons and their wives. But God wanted to use the Hebrew people to bring salvation to the human race. So the only ethnic groups mentioned here in Genesis 10 are those that might have contact with Israel. So ancestors of Asians, Amorians, and Europeans are not mentioned. The focus of the Old Testament is on the Jewish people, their emergence, their struggles, all the lessons they had to learn in preparation for giving mankind the Messiah who would atone for the sins of the world. So moving on to chapter 11 now, we find how the earth got divided into these different language groups. Chapter 11, verse 1. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. I don't know what that language was. I mean, a lot of people think, well, it must have been Hebrew because the Bible's written in Hebrew. Well, I don't know. You can't prove it. There might have been some language totally different from any language that exists on earth today, because all the languages we have today started from the Tower of Babel, which we'll get to in a minute. So whatever this common language was, they all spoke the same language, and they were all united. We find the first post-Diluvian, that means after the flood, civilization was in Shinar, which was a Hebrew name for Mesopotamia. In chapter 11, verse 2, it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. We know where Mount Ararat was. It was in northeastern Turkey. But evidently after, as the earth kept rising in those early years after the flood, and Mount Ararat kept getting higher and higher and getting colder and colder up there, of course they were moving down. They're moving to the south, down into the Fertile Crescent, where the Euphrates and Tigris rivers are. And that is known today as the land of Shinar. Mesopotamia, that comes from 2 Greek words, meso, middle, and potamia, from the word for river. It was the land between the rivers, between Tigris and Euphrates. And that's where the first human civilizations began after the flood. And they dwelt there, and they were multiplying. I believe they were multiplying rapidly. I believe these people were very healthy. As we look at the patriarchs here later on chapter 11, we find men routinely living to be at least 400 years old. And it only mentions the men, doesn't mention the women. Today, women tend on the average to live a few years longer than the men do on the average. So what if the women were also living to be 400 to 600 years? They could have had a lot of children. So I believe that the human population was probably exploding after they got off the ark and got off and had a brand new world with rain and abundant crops and all these things happening. Life was good, and they had lots of children. And so I did a spreadsheet exercise just to imagine how fast could the population have grown. And this is purely speculative, and it probably didn't happen at this ideal rate. But if the average woman had 10 children in 20 years' time, and a generation was 20 years, here's what would happen. In 300 years, you know how many human beings there would have been? 4,577,000,000. There wasn't just a small crowd here by the time that we get Abraham. There were millions of people in the world by Abraham's day. I'm sure of it. Now, after a while, diseases began to become prevalent, and wars began to become prevalent, and these humans began, as they began to grow in large populations and rival each other, they began to fight each other, and there were wars, they were killing each other, and all these bacteria and viruses that had gotten kind of wiped out by the flood began to reassert themselves, and as large groups of people lived together in close proximity, there become epidemics, and so the population probably didn't go quite that fast. And I don't think there were 3 billion people by Abraham's day. But point is, it did grow fast. I'm sure it did. It would normally do that. Verse 3, we didn't read that. Here they are, and they said to one to another, "Go to, let us make brick and burn them or bake them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar." So there's no rock quarries in the middle of the Mesopotamia there, middle of Iraq. So stone has to be carried in from some distance away, but they did have clay. And they discovered, or they maybe remember from before the flood days, that you could make good brick by heating up clay. And so they started making clay and building permanent buildings, permanent homes, and they had slime. That's referring to asphalt type tar. There was abundance of that in ancient times in the Mesopotamian area. We know that from many different records. So they had asphalt tar as a bonding agent to glue their bricks together, and they began building nice buildings. And then they got really ambitious. We'll go on to verse 4. And they said, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." So this is unity, but it's unity for the glory of mankind, not the glory of God. Now this verse is often misunderstood. Many people read that and they think that they actually thought that they were going to build a tower that reached all the way up to the home of God, to heaven. That's not what it is saying. The word heaven here is simply the hashemayim, the Hebrew word for sky. It's where the birds and the clouds are. The Bible talks about 3 heavens. There's the first heaven, which is where you have the birds flying around and clouds above them. And then there's outer space, where all the stars and the sun and the planets are. That's the second heaven. And there's the third heaven, which is beyond our universe. That's where God is. But normally, when the Old Testament talks about heaven, it's talking about the sky, the place where the birds fly, and the clouds drift across. And so they're going to reach unto the sky, is what they're saying. You know what? We still talk that way. You go to New York City, what do you see? You see skyscrapers. Do they actually literally scrape the sky? Of course not. These people were not stupid, okay? They didn't think they could actually build a tower that would go all the way up to the top of the sky. They weren't that stupid. They used language just like we use language today, okay? They'll reach up into the sky. What was their point? Their point was building something so tall that no matter how far away they went, or at least if not too far away, they'd be able to look back and see the central point, their home of mankind, the central great tower representing mankind, and they could always find their way back. So it's a central monument. Let's call it a monument to mankind. That's what the Tower of Babel represented, a monument to mankind. So this is the first skyscraper. I want you to put that in there. So just to remind you that they weren't stupid when they thought they weren't stupid. They'd say, oh, we can reach all the way up to the sky, to heaven. No. This was a popular subject of art back in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Here's a couple, several artistic representations of what people during the Renaissance thought the Tower of Babel might have looked like. It was to be a big tower, a monument to mankind. This artist painted it reaching up above some of the lower hanging clouds, didn't he? The idea was political unity of mankind, but that was displeasing to God. Verse 5 says, "And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded, and the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do." This is displeasing to God. Now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. God did not want to see mankind in total unity. Makes me wonder about what God feels about the UN, the United Nations. It's not hard to see all of this leading up to this one world government that is going to try to eradicate Christianity and Jews that we read about in the book of Revelation. Paul spoke to the Athenians, and I thought I had that here in my outline, but boy, this is something got really messed up here. But he said, speaking to the Athenians in Acts chapter 17, that God had chosen to have mankind scattered so that they might seek after God. Because in lack of unity, in people divided up into different nations and feeling very inadequate and isolated from one another, the idea was that they would be more prone to seek God, the God who had created them, the God that their ancestors had told them about. But anyway, this has the effect now of, God says in verse 7, "Let us go down and there confound their language," or confuse their language, "that they may not understand one another's speech." If they can't communicate one group with another group, they'll scatter. And that was the idea. It was God's will for humanity to spread all around the earth. Oh, here's it. Paul told the Greek intellectuals here. I do have it on. Here's what he said, using the New King James Version. "And God has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth," all the face of the earth, "and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings." Why? "So that they should seek the Lord, in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us." It was God's plan for mankind to be separated, to have different cultures, different languages. We weren't all supposed to speak the same language, dress alike, Chinese and Europeans and Africans, and everybody all dress the same and do exactly the same thing. God wanted us to find our own unique way of being. So we read on verse 8. It says, "So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city." They gave up because they didn't have enough people, hand me more bricks. What did you say? They couldn't communicate. Therefore is the name of it, the city, called Babel, or Bavel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. That's related to the Hebrew word for confuse. "And from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth." So that's the original origin of the name Bavel, Babel in English, which the Greeks turned into Babylon. Babylon is the Greek form, which crept into our Bibles of the Hebrew word Babel, or Bavel, as they would pronounce it. So, that's the end of the history of Noah's sons, but it's not the end of our lesson today, because we go right on into verse 10. These are the generations of Shem. Now at the beginning of the study of Genesis, we saw that it's divided up into 10 divisions. In each division, historical division, begins with the phrase, these are the generations of. That is, the word generations is used in Hebrew like we use the word history. This is the history of. So this is verse 10 says, as we put it in modern English, this is the history of Shem, or actually his descendants as we read on. So, I put this in graphical form to make this a little easier to visualize. So we read verse 10, Shem was 100 years old and begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. So his first child was born 2 years after the flood, when Shem was how old? 100 years old. So if he was 100 years old 2 years after the flood, that means he was born 98 years before the flood. But Noah had sons starting 100 years before the flood, as we read a few chapters back. So obviously Shem wasn't the oldest. It had to have been Japheth that was born 100 years before the flood, because Shem was born 98 years before the flood. And he lived after he begat Arphaxad, verse 11 says, 500 years, and begat sons and daughters. So how long did he live? 600 years. So put that on my little graph here. The darker shade of green represents his life until he had a son. At the age of 100, he had a son, and then he lived 500 more years. It's long, but remember, how long did Noah live? 950. Okay, there's the flood, just to help you remember. He's 98 years old when the flood comes. And his brother Japheth is 100 years old, and Ham a little bit younger than both of them. And so for close to 100 years, they helped their dad build this gigantic watertight craft, big, gigantic wooden box that's going to hold them and enough animals to restart the animal population. Now here's a son named Arphaxad. So Arphaxad is born when Shem is 100 years old, and then the medium color green shows how old he was when his first son came. Verse 12, Arphaxad lived 35 years and begat Selah. And Arphaxad lived after he begat Selah 403 years more, and he begat sons and daughters. I think he could have had a lot of sons and daughters in another 403 years. So this gives me an idea that the human population must have really exploded here after the flood. So how many people were there at Babel? Probably not just 1,000. There might have been 100,000 people there in Mesopotamia before God scattered languages. It's possible. Reading on, and Arphaxad and verse 14, and Selah lived 30 years and begat Eber. And Selah lived after he begat Eber 403 years, and he begat probably many sons and daughters. So there's the third column represents Selah. The dark green is before he was born, and then the medium green, how long it took before he had children, and then the lighter color green, how long he lived after he started having children, he and his wife. I'm sure he had some help from a wife. Going on, verse 16, verse 14, and Selah lived 30 years and begat Eber, and Selah lived after he begot Eber, 403. Okay, verse 16. Eber lived 34 years and begat Peleg. And Eber lived after he begot Peleg 430 years and begat sons and daughters. So there's Peleg. Now Peleg, you notice that his column ends is shorter than the others. He didn't live very long. Poor Peleg. Verse 18 says he lived 30 years and begat Reu, and Peleg lived after he begot Reu only 209 years. And he begat sons and daughters. So he had a shorter life. And then verse 20, and Reu lived 32 years and begat Serug. And Reu lived after he begat Serug, and I'm not pronouncing it in the Hebrew way, I'm just doing American English. He lived 207 years and begat sons and daughters. So Reu had, he didn't live 400 years either, did he? He only lived 207 years after his first son was, so he lived a total of only what? 239 years. Notice how lifespans are getting shorter as time goes on. Verse 22, Serug lived 30 years and begat Nahor, and Serug lived after he begot Nahor 200 years and begat sons and daughters. Serug lives a total of only 230 years, if you add up the numbers. Verse 24, Nahor lived 29 years and begat Terah. Nahor lived after he begot Terah 119 years and begat sons and daughters. And Terah, and so how long did Nahor live? Total of only 148 years. Really shortening lifespan here. And then his son Terah, verse 26, Terah lived 70 years. We get Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Abram, that's Abraham's name before he got changed to Abraham. But he wasn't, but we find out later on, take my word for it, but we'll show you later on in a couple weeks, that Abram was not born when Terah was 70. That was his older brother that was born. But Abram is named first here in verse 26 because he's most important in Hebrew history. Okay. So there's Abram. And there's the year that he was born. Now, what's significant about this? You know what the red line represents? That represents how long Noah lived. Do you realize that Noah, who didn't die until he was well over 900 years, was still alive while all these other generations were coming along? What that tells me is that Abraham had close to first-hand knowledge about the flood. This is not some legend that grew over time. Noah told it to Shem, to his grandson Arphaxad, to his great-grandson Selah, to his great-great-grandson Eber, and so on. They all got the story straight from Noah. And Noah told it many, many times. Well, how did Noah know about Adam and Eve and the fall? Well, as you might recall, we showed that there was quite an overlap since Adam lived 900 and some years to the time of Noah. Noah's father, Lamech, could have spoken directly to Adam. After those hundreds and hundreds of years, Adam was still alive and could have told Noah's dad, Lamech, what happened, how they first found out they'd been created, and how they fell in the Garden of Eden, and the curse and all of that. He got it straight. So my point is that you could possibly have had only two intermediate parties between Adam and Abraham to know the whole story, from creation to the flood, to pass it on to Isaac and Jacob and all of Israel's sons. And it was faithfully retold and preserved because now you have hundreds or thousands of people that have heard the story told from their father. And so Moses has a very accurate account. Now, and I realize that God could have told him, but the story that we have in the book of Genesis has all the earmarks of a story faithfully retold rather than being dictated. And so I believe that's how God transmitted it to us. He used real people to get the story. Oh, we're out of time. I'm sorry. So All right, we'll close right there. Let's pray. Father, thank you for giving us the story here, and help us, Lord, to appreciate how you arranged for the Word of God and the stories to be faithfully recorded for us, unlike the other stories of other tribes around the world. Now, Father, as we regroup in this room for our morning service, help us, Lord, to focus our minds upon what you have done for us, your death and atonement, and what we owe. Bless our service that we are about to have. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.